Well, good evening and welcome to our weekly study of the Gospel of John. Um, my name is Henry Neufeld and I lead this study each week. Let's go to the Lord in prayer as we start. Lord, I thank you for your Spirit that you have sent, for the one that you sent for our salvation. And I pray that the Spirit will be with us and guide us into the truth you have for us. In Jesus' name. Okay, I have a guest tonight. This is an interview with Dr. Drew Smith, who is the author of the book Reframing Irrelevant Faith. And we'll talk a little bit about that later, but we're more interested tonight in the topic of his dissertation, which is on the Gospel of Mark. And I'll ask him a whole bunch more questions about that. But we're going to start out with the idea of adoptionism. Adoptionism is the idea that rather than being the Son of God from birth or coming as the Son of God, Jesus was a human who was adopted by God as his son. Mark shares with the Gospel of John the characteristic of not having a birth narrative, and that means that sometimes people suggest that the author either didn't know of or didn't believe in the virgin birth, because that's not where they start the story, as Matthew and Luke do. So would you consider Mark to be an adoptionist document? Does it actually support that theology?
Well, I guess I would start by answering in saying that I suppose that it could, given the fact that it is absent of a birth narrative as we have in Matthew and as we have in Luke. It's absent of a declaration of preexistence that we have in the Gospel of John. Jesus, of course, comes on the scene in Mark at the baptism, where he is called, "You are my beloved Son," by the voice from heaven, we presume to be God. So I suppose in that sense, yes, it could, but I would not base any sort of theological understanding on maybe perhaps what is absent from Mark. Mark seems not concerned about Jesus's upbringing, his birth. Everything starts at the baptism. In fact, if you read Mark and any references to Jesus's family come off negatively. There in Mark chapter 3, where they basically accuse him of being insane. And Mark seems to tell that story aligning in some way Jesus's family with his religious opponents. And then, of course, in Mark chapter 6, where he's in the synagogue in Nazareth amongst his larger hometown crowd, they're scandalized by what he says. So the absence of any birth, angelic appearances, these sorts of things that you find in Luke and Matthew, I don't necessarily think give complete strength to the adoptionist. I will say this, that it seems to me that in Mark, there is an emphasis upon Jesus and his separability from God, but also his inseparability. The very beginning of Mark tells us that this is the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God, if we understand that the Son of God is original to the text, which there's some debate on that, but nevertheless. And then you get the declaration of the way of the Lord. And I think it's Joel Marcus, if I recall correctly, argued that this way of the Lord is Jesus's way and God's way. So there's this back and forth between the separability and the inseparability of God. If you look at some of the statements that Jesus makes, where he says, I have come out, the one who sent me, those are clear statements of his understanding of his commission from God and stuff. And of course, the reference to the Son of God, or you are my beloved Son, from God, both in the baptism and the transfiguration, and then also there at the cross from the centurion, and the evil spirits as well. The Son of Most High God, Son of God. So I would not necessarily say that Mark clearly supports an adoptionist point of view, but I think certainly compared to the other two synoptic gospels and the Gospel of John, you get what we might consider to be a lower Christology, yet I don't think we could push that too far.
Okay, I'm going to take just kind of a detour here. You mentioned the textual issue in Mark chapter 1. One of the things I've been doing in John is occasionally looking at some of these nuts and bolts that people don't really look at all that often.
Yeah.
And just talk about it a little bit. I was looking here in my UBS Greek New Testament, and they rate that reading as a C.
Yeah.
Which I think is it's a bare majority of the committee.
Yeah, I think
favored, including, I think that's like 3 out of 5. So 2 of the scholars on that committee said no, if I remember right.
Right, and you know, I didn't spend a lot of time debating that whole issue in terms of, you know, what it meant to the gospel. I think that people are split, seem to be, because the evidence is not as clear as we would like it in terms of the external evidence, in terms of the textual evidence itself, but also the internal evidence. You know, Son of God seems to be a bracket, you know, in the Gospel of Mark, where you have the baptism, the crucifixion, where Jesus is referred to as the Son of God, and at the Transfiguration. So it seems to be an important title. I take it as probable, extremely probable, that it is original to Mark's text. And so I accept its validity.
I would think, you know, and I'm looking, I mean, I can certainly say that, you know, the evidence here is enough spread across the map to make it an interesting choice. But at the same time, I would think that if you accept that as original, that actually does weigh against an adoptionist reading, in essence, that whatever it is that's the cause of Christ being the Son of God, it is something that carries through the entire gospel.
Right. Yes. And of course, you know, that verse there in Mark, that 1:1, is, of course, basically the title to the gospel itself. Mark is declaring that this is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And then, of course, then tying it to Old Testament prophecy, specifically attributing that to Isaiah. So picking up Isaiah's New Exodus theology, if you will, or New Exodus story, and bringing it into the contemporary ears of Mark's audience.
Okay. Now, I've got a couple more questions along that line. Of course, I actually have enough questions that I could keep you for 2 or 3 hours, but I bet you wouldn't be want to do that, and I probably would lose the audience by the time we're done. But there's certainly enough interesting material, and we'll talk a little bit more about your book and also stuff that you're working on a little bit later. But we've talked now basically a textual issue in the first verse. At the end of Mark, we have one that's fairly famous, which is the ending of Mark with in chapter 16, verse 8. And I think many of the current versions of the Bible would put verses 9 through 20 of Mark in brackets. They usually say something like the best manuscripts don't include that. And part of the reason is to say there would be plenty of motivation, considering it ends, "For they were afraid," as the end of verse 8, that people might not want that to be the ending of the gospel. So speaking of internal evidence, that is one way to look at that. So do you want to comment in general on that? And then I know I'd told you ahead of time that I was going to ask you about how you read the meaning there of verse 8. If you can go ahead with that. I also have an audience question that I'll pick up as soon as we get disentangled from the textual issue here.
Well, I mean, I think I would definitely side with most Markan scholars that the gospel does end in 16:8. It certainly did present a problem because the resurrected Jesus does not appear, and that was problematic for not only whoever added these additions to the end of Mark, but Matthew and Luke were neither satisfied with that ending as well. But I think, and I think it was the late Donald Jewell, if I remember right, who argued that it basically should not even be in parentheses anymore, and that it should be completely taken out of English translations, the longer ending and stuff. As far as my interpretation of it, the women go away in fear and they tell no one. Well, I think there's a different way of reading that. They told someone, they told no one except those who they were supposed to tell. I would sort of elaborate on that, and perhaps that's the meaning there. Not literally that they told no one, but perhaps that they told no one except who they were supposed to tell. But from a literary standpoint, you've got this, he will meet you in Galilee. That returns to the beginning in the first calling of the disciples. So the ending is just the beginning. That the ending of the Gospel of Mark means that you go back, and it's almost in a somewhat circular fashion. That the gospel just doesn't end. You go back and you follow Jesus. And I made the comment before, and others have made this comment too, that Mark seems to function, at least at some level, as a manual of discipleship, if we could use that term, in which the disciples, the Christian community to which Mark is writing, understand that their following of Jesus begins at baptism, where Mark begins, that they go through and they face these different trials and conflicts and things of that nature, taking up the cross and following Jesus. But it's a never-ending thing in that sense. It's always, on that road to discipleship. So my interpretation of the ending would be a return to the beginning.
Okay, I think it's important to understand that reading. It's kind of interesting how we very often package a number of ways of viewing something together and either accept or discard them as one. And so there's kind of been the gospel ending in fear and the ending is not valid altogether, but there's other ways of reading that material.
Right, I think.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I just, I think so. And I think that's why I, prefer, at least, from my perspective, a narrative approach to the gospel itself, reading it as a narrative, which is what it is. It's not any sort of propositional theology or anything of that nature. It's a story. It's a narrative, specifically about Jesus. But as I argue in my dissertation, it's also about God. And those two, theology and Christology, are intertwine and play off one another. I guess I could use that term.
Okay, I'm definitely going to go back and we'll talk a little bit more about the narrative and so on. But I have actually now two audience questions up, and I will remind everybody that the quick Q&A app is active, and I'm talking to Dr. Drew Smith, author of the book Reframing Irrelevant Faith from Energeon Publications, but also who wrote his dissertation on the Gospel of Mark, and I'm going to ask him more about it at the University of Edinburgh. So let's get to our first audience question here, which is, if Son of God is understood as a synonym for King of Israel or Messiah, why must it necessarily support a high Christology?
Well, I don't know if it necessarily supports a high Christology in the sense, if you think in terms of the Gospel of John, there's definitely this references to Jesus as the Son of God and God as the Father, and the Father and I are one, which I would consider to be higher Christology. Mark, if we could, higher and lower, it's all relative, I suppose, in some sense, but Mark seems to be a lower Christology than John. But nevertheless, I think Jesus is presented as the one who acts for God, who speaks for God. If you pay attention to the conflict narratives between Jesus and the religious leaders, it's really over a question of who has the authority to speak for God. In terms of the miracles themselves, the casting out of demons, the unclean spirits, the raising of the dead, all of these things. In a sense, Jesus acts for God. Whether that's a high Christology, I don't know the scale that we determine these things. If we, go from a 1 to 10 or, something of that nature. But I think combined with the whole idea that Jesus is the Messiah, the anointed one in Mark, is the Son of God, represents something that relates Jesus to God in a very significant way. Now, again, we don't have Mark telling us anything about any sort of virgin birth. We don't have him telling us anything about a miraculous birth or anything. We know nothing of his birth. But I still don't think that necessarily Mark is portraying Jesus simply as a human being. I think there's something more there.
Okay. I'm going to move on. I've got one question that's not on the Q&A app. I'm going to move to that and then come back. Just be aware that we're going to be taking you back to the term Son of God.
Okay.
Here any moment. The question that the other audience question asks, how do you account for the vivid style and diction of Mark? That is, for example, using historical presence as compared with Matthew and Luke. If I recall my time with the Gospel, Mark uses way more, I think, historical presence. But I don't remember numbers.
Well, yeah, and I don't have the numbers before me and stuff, but yeah, I like the idea of the vivid presentation. You've in terms of the historical present, but also I think in the continual repetition of this immediately. This is a fast-paced, sort of gospel, which is perhaps one of the reasons. Again, there could be multiple reasons, which is perhaps one of the reasons maybe that he doesn't tell anything about the origin of Jesus in terms of his birth. Everything starts as an adult. Why should we be concerned about all these preliminary issues when the heart of the matter is this apocalyptic, image that the kingdom of God is here, it's near, it's come, and so Jesus is in this fast pace, sort of thing. This whole idea that, Jesus doesn't go out looking, for example, he doesn't go out looking for people to heal. They come to him, so I think Mark and all of that is representing this sort of fast-paced for a hurried time. If Mark is writing in late 60s, 70 or so, around the time of the Jewish War and the destruction of the temple, these are crucial times, and perhaps that's the message through the narrative, is he's representing that this is a hurried narrative for hurried times.
Okay, let me. Actually, I had a question, but it's disappeared. I had another audience question, but it related to Son of God again, but using the example of Nathanael out of John calling Jesus the Messiah and the Son of God. It's interesting that Harold Weiss, who wrote the book that I'm using in my study week to week, considers Son of God to actually be the lesser title in the Gospel of John. That the Son of Man, which he thinks in John is taken from Daniel 7, the apocalyptic image, Son of Man, is the higher title in the Gospel of John, although in passing he says, unlike in the Synoptic Gospels. So I'm guessing he would take Son of God in Mark as the higher title, as opposed to Son of Man, and in general see Son of Man more in the Ezekiel, Son of Man, do whatever, human, do whatever kind of sense. So, how would that, I don't know if you would agree with him on John, where he, in the priority of the two titles, but how would that compare to Mark?
Well, I think in terms of John, I would just have to go back and really look at those titles and stuff. But in terms of Mark, I think Son of God is a crucial title that the audience knows. The audience knows this title. The audience are privy to the beginning of the gospel. The audience are privy to the baptism, which it appears that no one else is, because the voice from heaven says, "You are my beloved son." So I would take that as this is a direct speech from God to Jesus and nobody else. Now, obviously, on the Mount of Transfiguration, where it says, "This is my beloved son, listen to him," you have the three disciples who hear this and stuff. But it's a title that I think the audience is privy to. In terms of the Son of Man, I think it's a crucial title too in Mark, mainly because Jesus uses it as a self-reference to himself. I do think it is a reference to the human one, but I think it is also, in a sense of looking at it in three categories, if you will. One, in terms of the authority of the Son of Man on earth, and specifically in Mark chapter 2, where it talks about the Son of Man, his authority to forgive sins. The Son of Man used in the passion predictions of Jesus, in which he's going to be handed over, which passive verb, which could imply the will of God behind that. So, and then the Son of Man who will be vindicated, specifically as you talk about Son of Man in John, Mark chapter 13. So, in a sense, you could look at the Son of Man in those three categories: authority on earth, his passion and death on the cross, and then his vindication. All that seem to tie Jesus to God.
Okay, well, we're on this subject then. How would you relate this then to the Messianic Secret idea? You were saying what brought my brain onto this topic, and when we could hardly talk about Mark without talking about Messianic Secrets,
No.
But but what turned me to thinking about it, you were talking about the people coming to him to be healed, and I was reminded of the way also that he walks into a place and the demons react without him doing anything. He's usually casting out demons because they basically popped up and started to tell him, to announce who he is, and so that he tells them to shut up and go away.
Exactly.
So and how does that fit? And I'm wondering also, since you're talking about Mark as a manual of discipleship, does that tie into that thought as well? What's going on here?
Well, my take on the Messianic Secret, as it's been termed, and that's when, of course, Jesus heals somebody and then he orders them to tell no one. So he wants these things to remain secret. My take on it is a long-standing one. I think is that the true revelation of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark does not come until his crucifixion. The great deal of emphasis upon the crucifixion, passion predictions, Jesus headed to Jerusalem, and these sorts of things. So I take that Jesus sees his broader mission as to proclaim the gospel and to walk the way of God, and to walk that road towards Jerusalem, literally and metaphorically, if we're thinking in terms of discipleship. So I think second part of your question, I think, had to do with the discipleship and the manual of discipleship. I think I'm not sure how the Messianic Secret fit into that in that sense. But I do think, this whole idea of this book of discipleship, that Jesus is the example to follow. I mean, I was thinking about this today when I was thinking about our discussion tonight. I was reminded, of course, of John in chapter 20. He says, these things have been written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. There's nothing of that in Mark. It's the emphasis upon follow, not believe. Now, believe is used. I think it's used 6 or 7 times, and faith is used. So there's this element of faith. Jesus says to the woman, your faith has healed you. Says to the disciples, you still not have faith. He says to the man who the disciples couldn't cast out, have faith. These are, but it's never have faith in me. In fact, in recalling this whole idea of faith, specifically when Peter sees the withered tree that Jesus is cursed, Jesus tells him to have faith in God. But I think the emphasis within Mark, as opposed to John is you believe in Jesus. Mark is you follow Jesus. Now, I don't know what distinction that is. Obviously, if the Gospel of Mark is telling folks to follow Jesus, then they have to believe something about him.
It's one of those interesting comparisons, which leads me right back to the we were talking just a little bit about the titles and the level of the Christology, where you're talking about the conflict. Harold Weiss brings out something similar when he talks about that John has come out openly in the prologue saying Jesus is God, and then a lot of the other language is trying to deal with the corner that he's painted himself into, which is people are asking, okay, what does that mean?
Yeah.
And of course, a lot of those statements have become serious fodder for the Christological debates for centuries thereafter. So many of the statements about Jesus, that were debated come from the Gospel of John. It sounds like, though, that we're hearing a kind of a similar, with God, with us kind of tension in the Gospel of Mark as well.
Yes, if you do a search of theos in Mark's Gospel, most of the references to God are in the genitive form relating him. But the kingdom of God is one of the more dominant we find in terms of the mention of God. And of course, you get Jesus, who's called the Son of God, at the beginning of the Gospel, and then and then of course by the demons and the Son of the Most High God. So I kind of lost my train of thought. I was looking at some notes I had, but you get references, Jesus talking about the will of God, the command of God, the word of God, giving the things that are Caesar's, they're Caesar's, the things that are God's. A reference to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but is the God of living. Your God. God seems to. There's only a minor role, at least for the word theos, absent of any relation of theos to something, the kingdom or the son or the will or the commandment or the word. Now, does God play a bigger role than that, than outside the Greek term theos? Well, definitely. I mean, the baptism is one of those. The passive verbs that you have, the transfiguration, those sorts of things. A careful reading of Mark shows that God is behind the scenes role, if you will.
Okay, I'm going to hold that thought. I'm going to do let's talk a little bit about your book and what we're working on. I have another audience question to in the controversial department that we'll pick up right after we do this, having to do with the dating and priority. So just, put that hat on while we're talking about your book.
Sure.
I'm talking with Drew Smith, his PhD from the University of Edinburgh, dealing with the Gospel according to Mark, and in particular, I guess we could call narrative critical reading. That's my term here, and I'm going to ask him some more about that in the second half, right after I do our next audience question. I want to mention, folks, that Drew is working up an outline for a study guide on doing biblical theology that I hope to get a chance to look at here sometime soon. And I think that's going to be very interesting. But he's also the author of the book, and I'm going to put the cover up here. His current book is Reframing a Relevant Faith. And this is just, again, a basic talking about Christianity and its meaning here in the 21st century world. So it's a very broad-ranging book and quite an interesting read. I've had a couple of churches take it up as a, as a basic study as they look at their faith. So you make sure everybody's got that. Now sharing the cover of the book. That's off of my screen, Reframing a Relevant Faith by Drew Smith. And so, having mentioned that book, we're going to kind of take you off a break there, Drew, and give you this audience question, which I had something like it in mind, except I might have been a little less specific. But the question is, synoptic critics usually place Mark first because it appears to be more primitive. And I'm sure with your dating and so on that you're working with Mark and priority as far as the synoptic problem would be concerned. You can correct me if I'm wrong. Why would, I think this should be an eyewitness like Matthew, have depended on Mark for his information, and does not the external evidence support a Matthean priority, which I guess would be primarily there we should refer to the patristic evidence. That's my little note. Right. That should give you a chance to talk about that subject in general, but leave me enough time to talk about narrative study.
Sure. Well, in terms of where I would date Mark, I would put it in the late 60s, early 70s. Simply the fact, of course, of the discussion of the temple and its destruction, and we certainly can date the temple's destruction very specifically to the year 70. I do agree with, I think, the majority of Markan scholars that Mark is the first gospel of the four to be written. I think that Mark is writing for, again, hurried times, if you will, apocalyptic times. And I think Matthew and Luke, using Mark as a source, expand upon that. And, of course, the infamous Q source and whatever other sources they may have. I would sort of answer the question in terms of Matthew, in terms of an eyewitness. That's a little bit difficult. I know tradition has sort of said Matthew was an eyewitness to these things, but we have to remember that these titles to the Gospels were not original to the text. So the authors of these texts could be, hotly debated. Mark, in and of itself, could be extremely hotly debated, because even though we have the reference in Clement about Mark recording everything Peter told him, we don't know who this Mark is. I mean, that's a common name in the Roman world and stuff. So I would answer the question in terms of Matthew as an eyewitness, that's not necessarily I think there would be a little bit more thinking that we would have to do on that as to terms of who that author actually is. But I would side with Mark in priority in the fact that Mark it seems to me that Matthew and Luke would expand more. I think it would be the tendency of an author to expand on the story than to shorten a story.
Okay, well, that's another one of those topics that we could probably spend quite a bit of time on. And as a matter of fact, I have, but I'm going to resist the temptation to spend the time working through the priority, the order of authorship. And the main reason for that is because I want to talk to you a little bit about what your dissertation was about. As we were talking just before this, we talked about, you were mentioning looking at God as, looking at Mark as a story and looking at God as a character in the story.
Right.
So can you expand what is this kind of reading, and is this a kind of reading approach somewhere in there, tell us, that we can do without a PhD in New Testament?
Oh yeah, definitely. I think so. It's a narrative critical approach in the broader sense of the term. Narrative criticism was, taken from the literary critical world and brought into biblical studies and brought into gospel studies to look at these stories, not the behind the scenes sources or the forms of these stories, whether they be a miracle form or a teaching form or whatever, and not necessarily the redaction of these stories by an author but looking at the text as a finished product, as a finished whole. Understanding that you have to deal with textual variants and those sorts of things, but nevertheless, looking at the story as a finished story. And with that, with the narrative critical approach, you're paying attention to things like plot. You're paying attention to things like settings and scenes and characters. And what kind of characters are they? Flat characters or full characters, and all of these sorts of things. And how these stories are tied, tied together from this plot. And to me, it offers an avenue into doing the theology of a gospel, in my case, namely Mark, by offering a very close reading of the text. And in that sense, anybody can do that. If you can read and you read closely, I think it calls for multiple readings. I think it calls for approaching the text with fresh eyes, not just assuming what the text says, or not necessarily filling in the gaps from another text, but paying close attention to what the narrative is saying, but not only just what the narrative is saying, how is the narrative saying it? And that to me, I think is crucial to a close reading of the text. For example, and a lot of folks know about this, but Mark has a tendency to use what is a sandwich technique. One of the most, the one that stands out most probably is when Jesus is in the crowd and Jairus comes to him, the synagogue leader, and says, "My daughter is of death's door. You've got to come. You've got to help her." And then the woman who had been hemorrhaging for 12 years touches the hem of his garment, and heals, and he stops and he says, "Your faith has made you well." Okay. That story interrupts Jairus's need, and you don't hear the end of Jairus's story until after the full story of the woman is told. Those stories go together. And so that's a sandwich sort of technique in which you've got two stories on either side of one story, or not two stories, but one story beginning and end, serving as bookends or if you want to use sandwiches, bread pieces to what's in the middle and stuff. So I think paying attention to not only what the gospel is saying, but how the gospel is saying it is key to a narrative approach.
Okay, so when you're talking about God as a character in the story, and I can certainly hear some people, if I was talking to them about this, and they'd say, you know, God is God. How do I make God a character in the story? But of course, if you, I think if you read the Bible closely all the way through, yes, God is very much a character in the story. You know, in many, many places. Certainly people get surprised sometimes in reading Genesis and having Abraham get into an argument with God, and then you get to Exodus and Moses gets into arguments with God. And
Right.
God is very much a character in the story all the way through. And one author that I've read, you know, calls the Bible essentially a record, you know, of people seeing God act in history. So yes, there would be that.
Yeah.
So
Mm-hmm.
Tell us something a little bit about the character of God in the Gospel of Mark then.
Well, go ahead.
I was just going to say is, you know, to clarify my question there is, what characteristics are emphasized? Is God more, you know, a flat character? How much is God? Are we told about God within the story? And you know, so if you were to say, just as a literary assignment, give the characterization of God as contained in the story in Mark, what would we be seeing?
Well, I think in terms of you know, and of course this the issue of God, you know, as you mentioned, if you look at the Hebrew Bibles, God is definitely a character. But Niels Dahl, famous New Testament scholar at Yale, many years ago, I forget the date of it, but I have it. He wrote an essay called the Neglected Factor in New Testament Theology, in which he argued there's not enough study of God in the New Testament. You know, and so many folks picked up that sort of cue, including me, and said, you know, he's right. Let's go back and look at this, because the emphasis upon Jesus and upon the Christology. My reading of Mark is that, and I'll go back to what I said earlier, is that there is a separability, but an inseparability between Jesus and God in the Gospel of Mark. And I would sort of phrase it this way. Mark has a Christological theology, but also a theological Christology, in the sense, because if you think about it in terms of the beginning of the gospel that Mark says, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as Isaiah prophesied, see, I am sending my messenger. Well, that I is God. So from the very beginning, you know, Mark picks up the story from Israel's past, but the pronoun has not changed. The subject of that pronoun is God. I am sending my messenger ahead of you who will prepare the way of the Lord. Well, prepare the way of the Lord in the Hebrew Bible is prepare the way of God. So again, I'll point out to Joel Marcus's argument that way of the Lord is both Jesus and God. So in that sense, to kind of boil it down a little bit, I think if we look at the gospel, it seems to me that Mark presents God as the authoritative authenticator of who Jesus is. And it's God who declares that Jesus, you are my beloved son. And in that sense, Jesus is then the authoritative actor and speaker for God. God is also presented as the commissioner of Jesus, and Jesus is seen as the one who carries out the will of God. And then I think finally, God is presented as this vindicator and exalter of Jesus, and Jesus is presented as the glorified Son of Man, Son of God. it's probably a little bit more complicated, and I'm trying to remember bits and pieces of my dissertation, but I think that's it in a nutshell. Is that, yes, Jesus is the protagonist in the story, but it seems to me that God plays a significant role in who Jesus is and what Jesus does. And for me, it all goes back to that moment of baptism, where Jesus has this religious experience. And then all of a sudden, he comes out preaching, he comes out healing, he comes out teaching.
Okay, so speaking of characters, and you might put on the back burner that I'd really maybe in a few minutes, if we have the time, ask, how does somebody who is doing this for their personal Bible study, how do you set out to do this? A close reading of the text. Are there any particular books, tools, whatever that you would suggest, any particular approaches? But I want to lay that one aside for a second. You're talking about roles of people. We've talked about Jesus and God and that tension, separability, inseparability. In a reading Mark as a story, what role is it that the disciples in the book are playing?
Well, the disciples always come off bad. Let's just say that. Well, not always, but I think there's this calling of the disciples, and the emphasis upon the disciples is to be with Jesus. Not to do things for Jesus, but to be with him. Yes, he does send them out, in Mark chapter 6. And they do attempt to carry out the casting out of evil spirits, not able to do it in Mark chapter 9. I think for me, the disciples, from a literary standpoint, represent humanity. They represent real characters. They represent Mark's audience. We can't figure out who this Jesus is, so we're just as confused as the disciples are. And I think that's, if you think about in terms of the reference at the very end of the Gospel of Mark, where the angel, or the young man, we should say, dressed in white, says to the woman, go and tell Peter that he will meet you in Galilee. I think that's, since Peter sort of plays the buffoon, if you will, in the story. I think that reference to Peter is, and to the disciples from the story point of view, but from an audience point of view, is that keep trying to understand, keep trying to go back from the very beginning and hear it again, if you will, hear the gospel again. Read, in our case, read the gospel again. So, for me, I think the narrative approach kind of fits into that. So I would say the disciples represent humanity before God. That they're failures, and that's kind of comforting.
So I'd have an interesting question then with that comes to my mind. If we're thinking a discipleship manual going on, then here, in a sense, part of the discipleship process is coming to understand who Jesus is. So even though you said earlier that Mark is more about following and less about believing, there is nonetheless this seeking of understanding that really goes on in both Gospels.
Yeah, I think so. And I think Mark, John seems to lay it out on the line is pretty, well, I don't want to say pretty clear, but in terms of who Jesus is God. I mean, let's just say that, and Mark really places this emphasis upon, do you not yet understand? Have you not perceived? And that to me is sort of it kind of leaves it mysterious out there in terms of a grasping and an understanding of who Jesus is. It's almost in a sense that we're constantly asking the question, or at least Mark may intend his audience to ask the question, who is this? Who is this? That in that sense, because I think Mark is sort of in the sense that maybe if you get Jesus figured out, you really don't have Jesus figured out. Or outsider thing. If you think you're an insider, you may be an outsider. If you think you're an outsider, you may be an insider. Because in opposition to the disciples who never really get it, it's the outsiders who actually do get it. It's the people, particularly the unnamed characters, and we think in particularly of some of the unnamed females, they're the ones that sort of get it. And the disciples who are supposed to be with Jesus, they don't get it.
That's an interesting thought for sure. The outsider insider, because you get a certain amount of that in Matthew 25, where all the people who think they're going to heaven aren't, and the ones who think they aren't going to heaven are, which is an aspect of the parable of the sheep and the goats that I've often thought gets very neglected in preaching about it.
Right.
Basically, in that scene, everybody who says, hey, I've been doing all this stuff for you, Lord, all of those people are out.
Yeah.
That's a very interesting line. Okay, I'm going back to audience question, which is a reprise, so that we can kind of expand on that. I do have at least another question or so. We'll see if we get to them. So picking this question up, he says, a better way of asking my original question is, where is there an unequivocal example in Mark where Son of God is not a synonym for King or Messiah?
Boy, I hadn't thought about that one. That's a good question. I'd have to give that some more thought. Synonym, I don't know. I don't know, because Mark, says that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and I guess that could be, well, I'd have to give that some more thought, because Mark does have this what might be called a two-step progression when he talks about things. I think specifically the one off the top of my head is when the Syrophoenician woman says she's Greek, a woman of Syrophoenician birth. That's a two-step progression to let the audience know this is a Gentile. This is a Gentile. So maybe it is that Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God. I'd have to give that a little more thought and stuff. I don't want to dismiss that, but in terms of the meaning of synonym, I'd have to give that some more thought.
Well, I'll tell you what, if you, I know you blog, I'll go and blog this tomorrow morning and send you the link. And if you get to the point where you want to comment some more on that,
sure.
I know where to find this particular audience member so that we can make sure he sees the answer.
Yeah, okay.
Because I was just looking at this. I was just kind of processing Mark 1:1, assuming Son of God is part of it. And I certainly couldn't call it an unequivocal example, because you have Jesus Christ, Jesus the Messiah, Son of God, would be one way. Speaking, doing it in English would be one way to read that. So, you might argue it the other way, but I can't call that one unequivocal.
Right.
So it would be an interesting thing to kind of follow through all of the Son of God references in Mark and see what there are.
Well, there's only specifically Son of God references. There's only the one at verse 1, if we take it to be original, and then the demons speak it, and then the centurion at the crucifixion, where you have Son of God, weos, theos. Obviously, there's when God says, "You are my beloved Son," and this is my beloved Son. You do get a reference to you're, the Son of the Most High and the Son of the Blessed One too, from the evil spirit. So, which are circumlocutions for God as well. So,
I really like questions that make us go past the end of the time to figure out the answer.
yeah, I know.
I'm hoping I have enough time to ask this. And you have some time to do it. And like I said, I put this on my blog tomorrow, and maybe we can come up with some further comment on it, because it's kind of intriguing. What exactly is the Son of God? I was working with it in John, and I hadn't quite settled it in my own mind. And now I'm looking at it in Mark. When I interviewed Dr. Weiss on the 16th of August, I'm interviewing him for the last on the Gospel of John. He passed the question about adoptionism for you,
right?
So I'm going to take back the definition of Son of God, pass it back to him on the 16th when I interview him. So that sounds good. You mentioned that there was a strong emphasis on the crucifixion. And I know I'm not giving you much time with only about 4 minutes left to answer this, but would you say that there's a particular soteriology in the Gospel of Mark? How much could, let's say if you were to set about writing a dissertation on the soteriology of Mark, would it be a viable document?
Well, I think so. I think you would have to, of course, if probably the most famous saying along those lines would be the suffering servant statement in Mark 10, where Jesus says, "The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." How we interpret what that means, in terms of ransom, would be, I think, an avenue into that, but also I think in terms of the crucifixion itself and the scene that you have there, and this is where I think a close reading of the text kind of helps us as well, because you get those around the cross who are mocking Jesus, but what they say, the author is using to tell what is true about Jesus. He saved others, but he can't save himself. And those sorts of things. I'd have to look it up to see some of the exact wording there. I don't have it off the top of my head, but there's sort of an irony, if you will, in terms of what these mockers are saying at the cross, that Mark seems to be using to speak the truth about Jesus. And of course, then you get the centurion who says, this is the Son of God. Which, interestingly enough, there's a couple of interpreters who have taken that within the context of the mocking and says that the centurion is mocking as well, that he's saying in a sarcastic way. I don't know if we could, back that up, from a literary point of view, but it's an interesting take on it.
Okay, well, we are running out of time. I do need to correct myself. That is not August 16th. It's August 13th. I'll be talking with Dr. Weiss again. We had a great deal of fun at the previous interview with him. And we now have a good question to hit him with about the interpretation of Son of God, especially since he commented that it was different in the synoptics than in the Gospel of John. The usage of Son of God and Son of Man, he thinks, are different in the synoptics and in the Gospel according to John. So I will be sure to ask him about that. I will be holding this study each Thursday night between now and then. And then on August 20th, I'm starting a study of eschatology. The initial text we're going to study some of the definitions is Eschatology, a Participatory Study Guide by Dr. Edward Vick. And once I've used that to kind of lay out the map of the terrain, then we're going to look at some of the eschatological texts and some of the different ways that they can be read. So thanks for joining us. I'll remind you again, I've been talking with Dr. Drew Smith. He's the author of Reframing a Relevant Faith and a dissertation on the Gospel of Mark for the University of Edinburgh. So Drew, thanks so much for spending time and for being willing to redo this interview after our audio problems. I think our audio did really well tonight, so this is a good run. So thanks for joining us.
Thanks. Enjoyed it.